Hi, everyone. Welcome to our podcast. My name is Dolly, and I'm here with Michelle. I teach healing from childhood trauma and establishing a whole relationship with yourself and with those around you. And we're beginning our journey to study the laundry list together. Michelle and I have done the work, and we're bringing to you how we did the work and how to heal. So I
Mhm.
hope you will join us. We're beginning with trait one today. So Michelle will introduce herself and we will dive right into it.
Hi, everyone. So glad you're here with us. Uh, I'm Michelle, and I'm a lot of things. And what I'm bringing to this podcast is my experience in integration. I have a body of work called Integration Arts and has been massively supported by the work I've done in the 12-step fellowship. Adult children of alcoholics and dysfunctional families. So happy and excited to dive into these traits because I just keep thinking like, when you hear like that phrase, like adult child, it's like, wow, what does that mean? And like, I don't actually want to be that. And like, one of my biggest things with doing this podcast is really normalizing what it is like to grow up in a dysfunctional family and the effects that it has on us as an adult, and to say there is a way out and there is a solution. So happy to be here.
We are here to give you our hope, strength, and experience and share with you how we did this. So
Mhm.
let's get into the first trait. The first trait of, or you know what, even before that, let's describe what
Yeah.
is an
Yeah.
ACA. What is the laundry list? Why
Mhm.
do we need to do the work systematically studying the laundry list?
Mhm.
So
Totally.
who is an ACA?
Mhm.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Who is an ACA, an adult child? An adult child is a person who has grown up in a dysfunctional family, which can include a family that had substance abuse, um, a family that had varying levels of abuse, emotional, physical, mental, neglect, any of those things. And are affected by those things in their adult life. So they experienced it in childhood and they're affected in their adult life. And so it can have a lot of symptoms. And we're going to talk about the laundry list, but that's basically the essence of what an adult child. They move through the world sort of burdened by fear and self-doubt that was ingrained in childhood, and now it's affecting them as an adult.
Hmm.
So, yeah, that is like the simplest way that I could describe.
Yeah,
Do you add
exactly.
anything to that?
Yeah, that's how I understand ACA. An adult child is somebody who grew up physically, their
Mhm.
age chronologically, but they have parts of them are frozen at that young child age where
Yes.
they were maybe hurt, and the shock of the trauma has their inner child frozen in time. So
Yes.
they move around in the world physically in an adult body, but their soul, they're acting from that wounded inner child. And you
Mhm.
can see that in their behavior, in their personality, in their reactivity,
Mhm.
right? So many, and that's what is called the traits, the behavioral patterns of an adult child, such as reactivity, such
Mhm.
as acting out of confusing love and pity, and so many other dysfunctional patterns that we picked up as children. Now we're acting on them as adults, and that's what makes an adult child. And it's a really, really painful way to live. And
Mm.
like Michelle was saying, there is a way out, and we're here to show you how we did it so
Mhm.
you can too.
Yeah, so beautifully stated. Yeah. I love what you said around like frozen in time. I really, really, really resonate with that. Just that like there's a 8-year-old Michelle like consciousness and version of me inside that comes alive and acts through my physical adult body. So that was so beautifully stated. Thank you.
Yeah, and you feel that in your body. You feel that in your behavior, but we don't understand. We don't understand, why am I behaving this way? Why
Mhm.
am I acting out? Why do I isolate? Why do I avoid people? Why am I addicted to this emotional drama? So
Yeah.
we're going to unpack all of that. So
Yes.
let's get to the first trait that we're going to discuss today. We became isolated and afraid of people and authority figures.
Mhm.
So, and the other side of it is, we became the authority figures. We
Right, right.
became people who scare others, right?
Mhm.
So either you're a fearful victim and hiding, or you're somebody who's scaring other people. So these are two extremes that we live in as an ACA.
Mhm.
And the
Mhm.
idea is to heal, and we're going to talk about that too. How do we heal from this isolation, this fear of authority, or blending in with authority? How do we heal from that to become wholesome people that don't get into that power struggle
Mhm.
with others, that can have healthy give and take relationships, that
Mhm.
we don't immediately revert back to the past
Mhm.
when an authority figure shows up?
Yeah. I wanted to add something in before we dive into this first trait. Just this, like you might be hearing if you're listening, like the laundry list, this phrase is kind of like an interesting phrase, right?
Hmm.
Um, and what this list is 14 common traits that are exhibited by adult children of alcoholic and dysfunctional families. So if you go to any fellowship, there's going to be some kind of list being like, do you belong here? Do you identify with these traits? And so, we wanted to slow down and zoom in on each of these traits to help you identify, be like, am I an adult child or not? And so, yeah, these 14 common traits, as Dolly said, are these kind of symptoms and the effects and how they show up in our adult life. And then the the other side where is where we've kind of internalized our victimization and became victimizers. And so a lot of these behaviors show up in how we relate to other people. I like to think about the laundry list as like, oh, these are traits that reflect how I relate to myself as a result of growing up in a dysfunctional family. And then like the other laundry list is like, how do I relate to the world and other people from this overly aggressive victimizer standpoint. So we'll get into those. But if you're wondering, yeah, this laundry list really serves as a mirror to help you recognize the effects of your own childhood trauma and dysfunction and
Hmm.
bring more awareness to some of these unconscious behaviors.
Yeah, bring more awareness to some of these unconscious behaviors. And that's the first step. As we describe and do the work with you, this will bring awareness to you, and you can see if you relate to this or if this doesn't apply.
Mhm,
So,
mhm,
as we get into the first one, let's describe what is an authority figure. So we become isolated and afraid of people and authority figures. And for a child, an authority figure would be a parent, a teacher, a principal, a coach, an older sibling, anybody who exerts power and authority, and the child's safety depends on them.
mhm,
That many times children will say, oh, I will get into trouble if I do this, and my authority figure, my teacher, my parent does not approve. And the
mhm,
punishment that comes from not following the authority figure and what they're saying blindly. If a child doesn't blindly follow the authority figure and gets punished, they start to lose trust in the authority figure, in themselves, and in the whole process. That's
mhm,
when self-doubt begins, right?
mhm. Yeah.
So the child questions, can I trust them? Am I safe here? And that's how the relationship with the authority figure begins, with these questions. So I invite the listeners to also think back to the time when they were with under authority, and
Mhm,
what was their relationship with their authority. Were they able to trust the principal, the teacher, the coaches? Did they feel safe speaking up Were they, as a child, if they spoke up what they needed, what was the response from the
Mhm.
authority figure?
Oh, so key, so key. Because then
Yeah.
that's as an adult child, we're like that, oh, we're afraid. I'm afraid that what happened when I was a kid, when I spoke up and this authority figure had this specific reaction, that that's going to happen if I speak up at my job, like thinking about like, oh, who is the authority figure when you're an adult child? Bosses,
Mm-hmm.
in-laws, supervisors, community leaders, anybody perceived as having more control or power over us. Perceived is the key word, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So, yeah, so beautifully stated.
Yes, and then children, when they have these roles in dysfunctional families, they grow up and they find the same role in dysfunctional workplaces, in dysfunctional adult relationships, right? If they were a victim of the authority figures' anger, criticism, hate, jealousy, they will seek out, as an adult, authorities that will remind them and abuse them in the same manner.
Mm,
It's really sick to say, it's really heartbreaking to know that
mhm,
the dysfunction that we grow up with repeats itself, and we seek out that dysfunction. We seek out that type of abuse and neglect and criticism and punishment from authority figures that we got from our parents or coaches. So we, as a child, we learn to live as a victim. We learn to survive and manipulate and work with authority, but we have resentment, right? There's a lot of feelings that come up when you are being abused or oppressed by authority. So let's talk about that. If a
mm,
child is being abused by authority, how do they feel? How do they cope? What do they become?
mhm. Yeah.
Right? So there's fear, shame that I must be not enough, that my authority, the parent or the teacher, is punishing me, that I must have done something wrong, that my mother doesn't love me, that my father is hateful towards me or hostile environment. So the child punishes themselves. The child thinks that they are unworthy, and these feelings become permanent in our soul. We become shameful, we develop toxic guilt, we develop fear and anger, resentments. When we are oppressed, when our soul is oppressed by authority as a child, these negative feelings become a permanent emotional baggage in our lives.
Mm, yeah. Yeah, and it can be something like I'm sure you can feel kind of like the gravity of that, the gravity of like the feelings that we carry around. I'm one of these people that like learned a lot of ways to just like brush that aside. But it's always there, you know?
Mhm.
And these traits are here and you may not identify with all of them. So to be eligible to be in the fellowship of adult children, it's like you don't need to like get 14 out of 14. But if you just resonate with a couple of them, this could be the root of some of the struggles or the
Mental,
unmanageability
yeah.
and or
Mhm.
chaos in your life,
Mhm. Mhm.
So
Yep.
some some sort of everyday examples of this authority figure aspect is like, you're over preparing and obsessively reviewing your work before you send it to your boss, and it's driven by fear of making a mistake, right?
Mhm.
How many of
Mhm.
you can relate to that
Oh
experience?
my God, I can relate.
So much, right?
Yeah.
Or avoiding difficult conversations with an authority
Mhm.
figure,
Yep.
refusing to ask for a raise, or
Mhm.
expressing your concerns in the workplace. And
Yep.
this is a whole other separate trait, but folded into this one. But people pleasing are saying yes to everything to the
Mhm.
point of burnout and
Mhm.
resentment.
Yep.
And all of these are really driven by those emotions that you mentioned, like the fear and the shame.
Mhm.
And we get really good as adults like just moving through life with
Yeah.
this heavy stuff,
Yeah.
like carrying shame, being afraid, but this is just how life has to be. No, it doesn't have to be this way. There is a way out. So,
Yep. Yeah. Yeah. If you have been oppressed by a narcissistic parent, you will choose narcissistic bosses. You will choose narcissistic partners
mhm,
until you wake up to the fact that I have been groomed, or this is how I survived by becoming my false self. That
mhm,
I was groomed into people pleasing or perfectionism.
mhm,
When an authority figure constantly criticizes you, punishes you, belittles you, right? Sometimes parents do it because they want to help the child get
mhm,
better, but the constant picking just leads to the child's self-esteem being eroded. So we
mhm.
have an adult here who has all the knowledge, has done all the right things, but they cannot trust themselves
Yeah.
because the authority figure told them that you are not good enough, and they internalize that message from the authority figures that I'm not good enough. I need the authority's abuse or direction or oppression to do the right thing.
Mm,
A lot of
mm,
people get trained to just wait for authority to give them that push or that tell order to do something.
mhm.
They forget how to live as a sovereign, autonomous, free
Yeah.
thinking individual. And
Yeah.
our society rewards people who live like a perfectionist, people please, burn themselves out, over
Mhm,
compliant, submissive, right?
mhm.
All of these things come from walking on eggshells. Oh my God.
Yeah.
Like hypervigilance, all this affects our nervous system.
Mhm,
It affects our attachment styles,
mhm,
how much we achieve in life, how much we give up, how easily we give up on ourselves.
mhm,
All of this is related to when that person who was in charge of you as a child did not do their job.
mhm. Yeah. And you know what? I am really being called to bring something into this discussion that is so good. And it's that if you happen to be listening and be like, yeah, this is me, and there's any kind of heaviness that you're feeling or shame that's coming up, I want to tell you this. We repeat our dysfunctional patterns because it's familiar and comfortable. At a certain point, it is an intelligent survival skill. So if you're out there being like, oh, wow, I really resonate with this a lot and like starting to feel bad about yourself, I want to say you're not alone and that we repeat these patterns, same bosses, same relationships, finding ourselves in the same situation because it's comfortable and familiar. Now, this is kind of crazy because we're like, how can I want to create dysfunction and that rattled nervous system experience? Why would I want to repeat that? Why am I
Hmm.
repeating that?
Why? Yeah.
Right?
Why?
It's
Am I
because
crazy? Is it
it's
me? What's wrong with me?
right. It's because it's familiar and comfortable,
Yes.
and that's what we do as human beings.
Mhm.
And
If you don't,
what this fellowship is about is learning to repattern your ways, your behavior. It's
yes,
nervous system work, it's trauma work,
yes,
and then what is healthy becomes familiar and comfortable, and there is where the new life begins. So I want to
hmm,
inject that hope as we talk about really heavy stuff
amen. Yeah,
that it's like to normalize it. It's really
yes.
normalize it, release the shame on top of it. A lot of stuff happened to a lot of us growing up. And this program, this work, you get to you get to change. You get to
Mm-hmm.
transform. You don't, your past doesn't define you. So
Define you. Yeah,
yeah.
exactly. And awareness and understanding of what happened to me and asking those difficult questions of what was my relationship with authority figures and
Hmm.
what is now my relationship with authority figures. Am
Hmm.
I still behaving in the same people pleasing, getting burnt out ways? Or am I
Hmm.
pausing and realizing I'm overdoing it because I am feeling like I will be rejected. I'm overdoing it because I'm feeling like I will be abandoned, I will be neglected, that I will be punished in some way.
Hmm. Hmm.
So Our job then becomes to understand what are these beliefs that I have inherited from this abusive childhood or past trauma? What are these beliefs of unworthiness, that I am not good enough, that I cannot get a good this or I cannot achieve that, or that self doubt?
Mm-hmm.
So, shedding light on that shame, the toxic guilt, the feelings of unworthiness, those negative beliefs that you internalize as a child, now you shed light on them to understand which of this is true
Mm-hmm.
and which of it is just other people's beliefs, other people's generational trauma that I took on, that was just given to me. This was the legacy that was given to me.
Beautiful.
Separating yourself from the trauma, separating yourself from the oppression that you went through,
Mm-hmm.
right? That's the
Yeah,
first step.
totally. And I think this is a great place to just touch on this other laundry list,
Hmm.
this like how this trait can express itself in the other laundry list, as we mentioned, rather than being in the laundry list trait where, you're kind of victimized. Uh,
Yeah.
we become the very, authority figures who frightened us, right? So the exact laundry list trait is to cover up our fear of, this is so beautifully worded, by the way,
Yeah. Yeah.
to cover up our fear of people and our dread of isolation. We
Hmm.
tragically become the very authority figures who frighten and cause them to withdraw. So this is like really complex. And I will just say that like I identify with this other laundry list trait, that I became scary and I became an authority figure. Like I was the authority figure in my last relationship. And I was scary, and I was a teacher for a while, and I was an authority figure, and I could very much see these traits expressing themselves as a teacher. And so when I was working through laundry list stuff and being like, whoa,
Hmm.
like how my untreated ACA stuff was expressing itself in the classroom, and that I was just repeating cycles. Like it was hard, but like an honest truth that I was glad to recognize about myself. So I wonder if there's anybody out there who can relate to that, feeling afraid as a child, but then you're happen to find yourself in a role where you're kind of frightening. And that's not like you're just yelling at people all the time. It doesn't have to be that, but it's like a dynamic. Like maybe you're
Yeah.
a little bit more cold, maybe you're a little bit more threatening in your demeanor. But it's all protection, right?
Hmm.
All
Hmm. All
protection.
protection. Yeah.
Even like the laundry list and the other laundry list, it is an intelligent survival skill. I'm just going to keep hammering that
Hmm.
home,
Yes.
and that like
Yes.
there's a way out of that,
Hmm.
that served you,
Yeah.
and now there can be another way.
Yeah, it's a coping skill, right? You want to be bigger and scared. What happens when a human being is threatened? They
Hmm.
want to protect themselves. They want to become bigger and scarier. That you
Right.
can't scare me. I'm going to scare you first. You can't control or press me. I'm going to separate myself and be standoffish or whatever energetics, avoidance tactic that people use in order to create. It's all to create separateness, all because we are so scared that we will get hurt again, that we will get oppressed again, that the same dynamic will repeat itself, and people say, I've had enough. I'm not going to get abused. I'm not going to get controlled.
Mhm.
And they become really averse to that
Mhm.
enmeshment. And they become really averse to that dynamic where somebody comes and tells them what to do. They're
Mhm.
like, I'm done with this. I'm gonna call the shots and I'm gonna be in charge. But it is all the same. It's driven by fear. It is driven by shame. It is driven by anger. All
Mhm.
of that anger that we had to repress while our soul was so pure and getting oppressed. It
Mhm.
leads to so much internalized anger
Mhm.
that helps us be that cold person who can control, who can emotionally distance themselves. I mean, we
Mhm.
have good reasons to avoid people, to isolate, to to put rigid boundaries,
Yeah. And
right?
it's a false authority.
Mm-hmm.
It's and I think also I'm like, oh, it's a false power.
Yeah.
I like to be like, it's like eating French fries. It's like, oh,
And calling it potatoes,
right. It's like, oh, they're
calling
so
it
good going
vegetable.
down, but you feel empty. It's not actually giving you the nutrients. It's
Yes.
not true power that comes from within.
Mhm.
It is that false authority. So yeah.
Yeah, it's all these coping survival mechanisms are
Mhm.
stem out of fear, but they have one goal: to separate us from connection,
Mhm.
to
Yeah.
separate us from relationships. So there's either we're the victim or we're the victimizer, and there's a power differential. So people, you can't connect. That's what our inner critic wants. Our inner critic wants to keep us safe
Mhm.
by avoiding connection, by scaring others or being scared of others,
Mhm.
so that we don't have to get into that relation pain and wounding of a relationship is so deep that we'd rather isolate, we'd rather scare others than go through that pain again,
Yeah.
right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, Dolly, what do we do?
Right, that's what we should talk about.
If somebody's listening and they're like, okay, yep, laundry list trait is me.
Hmm. Hmm.
What do we do?
First is awareness, right? Like we talked
Mhm.
about, we always talk about awareness, conscious awareness
Mm,
with love, with acceptance. So
mhm,
once you get attuned to yourself and you realize these patterns have been happening over and over again all my life.
mhm,
It's insane how these patterns repeat themselves in every relationship, every work environment, all any partners you date. First is awareness. You consciously become aware and become a non-judgmental witness of yourself,
mhm,
of your partner, of the relationships you are in. And once you're aware of what's happening and what you're doing, you take a step back
mhm,
and you pause and you offer compassion to yourself. The first step has to be to love yourself so much, accept yourself so much that your inner child is soothed enough to sit through these storms,
mhm, mhm,
right? Like the compassion that we can provide to ourselves and sitting with our inner child, offering, apologizing to our inner child that I was a little child too, like from your higher self. You apologize to your inner child that I'm sorry you went through so much. I'm sorry you were hurt and oppressed and punished and when you were just perfect. Telling your inner child the words of affirmation that they didn't get.
mhm,
Healing your inner child with nourishment and nurture, compassion,
mhm,
really seeing them, really getting your inner family to trust you, really sitting with yourself and shedding light on all of the toxic guilt, shame, what you went through,
mhm,
and then accepting life the way it comes, the way it has happened,
mhm.
right? Radical acceptance. What has
Mm.
been your experience?
Yeah, and I was thinking as you were sharing about this that like the whole inner family work is like 20 podcast episodes for us
For
for
sure, we
sure.
gotta do that.
So if you're listening and being like, I don't actually know what an inner child is or like what inner child work is, like don't stress about that. But what Dolly just explained is like the heart of like the recovery in ACA, this reunion of your inner parts
Oh my God.
that have been, fractured off due to what you experienced. And I also want to say, if you're not, at that level of like even like being in tune with these parts of yourself, ACA offers a whole list of behaviors that are kind of like the antidote or like the flip side. And
Mm-hmm.
if you're a person who's like, okay, well, like what does it look like
Yeah.
to not isolate or not be afraid? Like, how do you get there? So
Mm-hmm.
there is like a flip side trait. And this whole flip side list really describes healthier integrated traits of an
Mm-hmm.
adult child. And as you move through the recovery process, they become more available to you.
Right.
And
Yeah.
so these are kind of like a list of opposites from the original laundry list trait that really reflect the emotional healing and the transformation that you go through in
Mm-hmm.
recovery in this program. And so, what is the flip side trait of what we've been discussing this whole time? It is we move out of isolation and
Mm-hmm.
are not unrealistically afraid of other people, even authority figures. And so,
Yes.
yeah, how do we
Mm.
move from that original laundry list trait to this integrated trait? You know,
Yeah.
what do we do? So, well, as you were saying, Dolly, it's like moving towards like growth, right? So recognizing your fear. And this is like not easy stuff. We're
No.
taking we're taking time to dive in these traits because it is not like, oh, I'm just going to move out of isolation. No, these are
Mm.
ingrained patterns that need time. Like your mind and your body need to catch up.
Yeah.
And so recognizing fear, adult children first need to really recognize and acknowledge their actual fear. Like I'm afraid of my boss.
Mm-hmm.
Like to
Mm-hmm.
admit it, right? Like
Right.
not
Yeah.
pretend to be like, oh, I'm just
Yeah.
doing all this work. And it's like, no,
Yep.
I'm
Mm-hmm.
afraid of my boss. I'm afraid to ask for this raise. And
Mm-hmm.
ask yourself these deep reflective questions. Why?
Mm-hmm.
And so through therapy, through step work, through support groups like ACA, you can start to unpack the origins of these deep-seated fears and
Mm-hmm.
start to reframe your
Mm-hmm.
relationship with authority figures. And this takes time. I'm still working on this one 8 years
Yeah.
in,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
but it's
I
so
think,
much better than it was.
yeah, I think this is one of the hardest ones. So
Mm-hmm.
for people who grew up with authoritarian parents or in a culture where children had no rights, they were just told what to do, when the oppression was so much. People who've been oppressed, I think this is a really big one for them, for me as well. This is a big one. So, like you're saying, it takes so much compassion, so much practice,
Mm-hmm.
and so much acceptance. And you begin with reflection, introspection,
Yep.
really exploring what relationship did I have in the past with authority. Was I safe? Was I able to speak my needs? Was I acknowledged? Was I validated? Was I celebrated? Was I cherished? And what does the relationship with authority figures looks like now? Do I
Mm-hmm.
seek people and do I chase people who will invalidate me, reject me, abandon me, make me work really hard? Or do I pause and say, hey, let me heal myself
Mm-hmm.
and then be with healthy people in healthy environments,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, and it's a bit of a domino effect,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Like if I wake up and like I meditate and I brush my teeth and I get a green smoothie, like I am domino affecting my day into
Mm-hmm.
more healthy choices, right?
Yeah.
So I see
Yeah.
exactly what you're saying as the same thing. It's like you have an experience and it starts to build some momentum. You're like, oh wow, like I
Mm-hmm.
asked for that raise or I made that communication and the whole world didn't just implode,
Yeah.
right? Because that's the
Yeah.
fear. That's the
Mm-hmm.
fear. And like every time I say this, I'm like, okay, is this intense? But it's like as adult children, we're kind of moving through the world like in fear that we're gonna be annihilated.
Yes.
You
Yeah.
know, that
Mm-hmm.
childhood fear, that walking on eggshells, like I'm not safe, I'm going to be annihilated.
Yep.
And as adults, we hopefully most of us are in safe situations and we still carry that fear. And so, yeah, how do we start to move to this integrated trait? Start working with your fear in the ways that we've just described.
Mm-hmm.
I also want to add that it's about also building self-trust, starting
Yes.
to build
Mm-hmm.
self-trust.
Mm-hmm.
And so having these experiences where you kind of take a risk to do something different than you normally would that feels safe, like I'm going to be quiet here, or I'm just going to become small.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Whatever your normal behavior of interacting with an authority figure is, like
Yeah.
doing it different and then learning to trust yourself, trust your judgment, trust your feelings, becoming less reliant on these coping strategies
Mm-hmm.
will help lessen this fear of authority figures. So it's like, I like to say you're building like your caseload. Like, oh,
Right.
I did this thing, and like it goes in the basket of like evidence that like
Yeah.
showing up this way is good, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, lots of different like ways to build self-trust, taking those healthy risks.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
and
Mm-hmm.
and seeing the results, and it might not always be great, like you
Right.
might get some pushback,
Mm-hmm.
but then having like a fellowship or a support group being like, good job that you took that risk.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't respond that great, but like, good job
Mm-hmm.
going, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Vulnerability is so scary.
Hmm.
Vulnerability requires so much practice, so much discernment, so much self-trust.
Hmm.
And to heal, you have to be vulnerable with your fear that, hey, I'm so scared. You have to be willing to look at the fear in the face and say, okay, this is a possibility. So this is a realistic fear that I should prepare for and mentally and this is an unrealistic fear that came from somewhere else, from my parents, from my surroundings, and this is an unrealistic fear that's wired into my nervous system. So
Hmm.
many people are scared of, say, for example, money
Hmm.
because it's wired into their nervous system that money brings problems, money is scary, money is hard to get. So these beliefs have been wired that authority is scary. So if you talk about the trait today, authority is scary, authority is going to harm me, authority is not going to look out for me, I can't be friends with authority, I have to submit or I have to control. These beliefs are wired in
Yeah.
our nervous system.
Hmm.
So nervous system work is going to be key in
Hmm.
healing your patterns, because when that uncomfortable moment comes, we have to be ready to sit down in that discomfort and tolerate saying no, tolerate someone a discomfort of facing our fear or saying that, hey, I'm not going to do this, or right. And like you're saying, when we do that, take that first step to safeguard our inner child, our inner family just becomes so happy. They want to trust us. Our inner child wants to be happy and secure and safe and trust us. So when you start taking those small steps to bring healing to yourself, your inner family starts to come along. They
Hmm.
start to trust you. Then you build confidence. They're confident in you. And that's how self esteem comes. Self esteem comes when you do esteemable acts for yourself, for your inner family, out of self respect. And that's another key point. We've got to respect ourselves enough. That worthiness, that unworthiness that's been wired in us, that's the first thing you got to question. And then tell yourself how worthy, valuable you are,
Hmm.
right? Accept your mistakes, accept them as part of being human. A lot of us beat ourselves up for the mistakes of the past. Accept them. Even when you try, like Michelle is saying, take the first step, try this, speak up. When you take the first step and you don't get the result that you want,
Hmm.
take it as a W. It's
Hmm.
still a win because you took the time and the effort to change the course of the pattern.
Beautiful. And, I was just thinking about myself in early recovery, that it was when I was first hearing about, okay, like affirmations and like saying positive things about myself, like there was this strong part of me, which was the inner critic, being like, that's not you. What are you talking about?
Mm-hmm.
You sound like a phony.
I
My
know,
inner
yeah.
critic was really strong. And part of this journey also was like me faking it until I made it.
Yes, oh my God,
Like,
yes.
wow, like mirror work.
Mm-hmm.
Looking in the
Mm-hmm.
mirror and saying things that I didn't actually believe. And then
Mm-hmm.
over time, that transforming and like settling into my body, into my nervous system. So I
Yeah.
love that. And so I was thinking, I was like, what does it look like to live in this integrated trait of,
Mm-hmm.
you know, no longer, being unrealistically afraid of people or authority
Mm-hmm.
figures and moving out of isolation. And so like we didn't like talk a ton about the isolation piece, and so I wanted to add that in here. But like,
Yeah. Yeah.
you might be thinking like, oh, like, is isolation mean like I'm home all the time and like I have no friends? And it's like, no, it can be really subtle, you
Mm-hmm.
know? Isolation is at the heart of it, like this withdrawal. It can be a physical withdrawal, an emotional. You can be in a room with somebody and be isolated, right?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Mental, emotionally, and like you're isolated because you're afraid of the rejection, you're afraid
Yeah.
of the criticism, you're afraid of the judgment, right?
Yeah.
And so
Mm-hmm.
this is a protection mechanism.
Mm-hmm.
It might look like screening phone calls and like not picking it up, or it might just be like you're walled off and you're not actually available for intimacy in a relationship. So
Yeah.
it can look a lot of different ways, but in this integrated trait, you know, you might start working on attending a bit more social gatherings with friends, feeling more comfortable speaking up and sharing your true self and sharing more about yourself, contributing to conversations rather than kind of hiding out and blending in with the crowd, right?
Mm-hmm.
It
Mm-hmm.
might look like uh the authority figure piece, like engaging confidently with a supervisor at work, voicing your ideas,
Mm-hmm.
participating in the team discussions without fearing the disapproval.
Mm-hmm.
Or it might be asking for feedback around something. Maybe you created some artwork or you wrote something and you're like, hey, would you give me some feedback? And you're not afraid of any the criticism, right? You
Yeah.
feel
Yeah.
secure within yourself. I know I've had many of these experiences, and that's how I know this trait is becoming more integrated, because I'm like, oh, I have this evidence
Mm-hmm.
that when I step out into this healthy behavior, like I feel good. I'm not feeling shame. Yeah.
Yeah. When you work hard to win your own respect and your own trust, the only person you're worried about winning over is yourself.
Hmm.
When you heal and you hold yourself in high regard along with your God, your recovery work, you are not worried about putting a person who looks like an abusive teacher on a pedestal,
Hmm.
right? You just respect yourself and you do the work to take care of yourself. You understand your duty to heal yourself and then speak up for your rights. You understand your duty to remove yourself from unsafe situations. You understand that it is my job to take care of myself, and if I'm anxious, to soothe my anxiety, to understand that this is unrealistic fear, this is realistic, to work on the powerlessness and the helplessness, right?
Hmm.
To let go of the deep seated anger and resentment. So, all of this is examples and picture of what healing and integration looks like as you do the work.
Hmm.
The
Yes.
work needs to be, so let's talk about the lonely. I wanted to touch base. That was a really good point. The loneliness and the isolation that
Hmm.
we should describe a little bit more. You know, the isolation and the loneliness, I felt like you were saying it was loneliness of the spirit, is what I felt.
Hmm.
That my soul was lonely. That yes, I had jobs and identity and roles of mother and, treating patients and taking care of business as an adult. But when I was unhealed, my soul was lonely because my inner family was afraid of letting anyone in.
Mm. Yep. Yep.
So that's the pathological loneliness that makes people sick,
Mm.
when their soul hurts and they are not able to find a way out.
Right.
That's when the desperation sets in, when you're so lonely, their soul is hurting so badly that you chase the wrong people, you please to a point of burnout, right?
Right. Yeah, I was gonna just add on a bit to that with like this soul hunger and loneliness, like the
Mm-hmm.
craving for filling up something that can only be filled up with like connection, you know?
Yes.
And
Mm-hmm.
so, yeah, I just love what you just laid out because, yeah, growing up, like the household wasn't safe.
Mm-hmm.
And so it made sense to withdraw
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
to wall off or protect yourself. But, hopefully you're not in that same environment, but you're
Mm-hmm.
still playing out the same protective mechanisms. And
Mm-hmm.
so, yeah, this soul loneliness and what I have found in my experience to be a healing balm for that is the sharing of the stories,
Yes.
is the, oh, I remember when something similar like that happened to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And like that is the beauty of healing in community and healing
Mm-hmm.
in connection, which is, at the root of 12-step fellowship.
Mm-hmm.
To share your story over and over and over again, help release the shame, and finally be seen
For
for
who
your
you
story,
are.
like for who you really are. Not like you
Mm.
are your story, but like here is my
Mm-hmm.
story and
Yeah.
here I am.
Yes. Yes.
And like that being
Mm-hmm.
like the juice, the
That's like,
honey, the
oh,
nectar,
that's like,
right? The chef's
yes.
kiss
That's like
of
that Michelle just
cultivating.
gave you the recipe. She just
Yeah,
dropped the recipe. That's like the mic drop.
yeah, yeah,
Exactly.
yeah,
Your soul heals with connection, and you
mm,
have to drop the fear and the shame and the insecurity that you feel and
mhm,
just be vulnerable and open with discernment, with
mhm.
people you find you can
Definitely,
slowly say with safely trust, with bosses you can trust, right?
totally.
That's how you find the
So glad,
best
I'm so
mentors.
glad you said that with
Mhm.
discernment, because that is something that adult children also struggle with.
Yes,
So
yes.
we can be really isolated, but then we can like be overly dependent and like
Yeah.
trust people that we shouldn't or overshare. So I'm so
Hmm.
glad you said that. I'm sure in future episodes we'll talk more about it, but just wanted
Yes.
to say that was, yes, thank you for adding that.
Yeah, exactly. As we do the work, we raise ourselves, that frozen inner child. We raise them from that frozen state of an 8-year-old, 5-year-old, 10-year-old to wholeness, to
Mm.
where that wounded part is not wounded anymore. It feels safe, secure, open, curious, right? But it all starts with compassion,
Yeah.
has been my experience.
Mhm.
All right. What else? Are we good? How do you
I think we're
feel?
good. We covered
You
a
feel
lot. We were talking about like, let's make this digestible. I was like, this is digestible. We're just like right at, we've covered what the laundry list trait is, um, the trait number one, how it is expressed when we become the victimizer, and this
hmm
integrated trait, and also gave some examples of like what it could look like, right? Because
Yeah.
like you might read the trait and be like, well, what does that look like in 2024? Like for
Yeah.
a modern person like me. And so I think we covered it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Good.
And if listeners have any questions, they can drop them in the comment or contact us. We're here to help and guide so that we can pay forward what has been given to us
Mhm.
so generously.
So, so generously. Yeah.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Yeah,
Everyone. See you
we
next
feel
time.
complete. We'll see you next time with trait 2 of the laundry list.
Yep. Bye-bye.
Bye.